Well, welcome to the bonus section of episode 13 of this week's episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. I was so brain fried over all the stuff that went on Tuesday when Caleb and I recorded the actual first episode, which you'll hear in the show after this addendum. I forgot to cover the one question I got for the update section. So I'm going to do that now, and then the regular episode that we recorded will start right after this little interlude, shall we say. So a few weeks ago, a gentleman sent me a YouTube video that runs about 27 minutes about something that's been well known in MMA for years, and that's many of the early Japanese, that were supposed to be Japanese MMA bouts, but involved professional wrestlers, were worked. And there's been suspicion about some of the Pride bouts as well. And I don't know exactly which Pride bouts might have been worked, but I know for sure that the Gracies have gone on record that they were all approached about working matches with some of the wrestlers that challenged them. They refused and had contests. But it's a pretty open secret that's been going on for in the past, in the early days of MMA. So the video is very good in talking about that, and it is a YouTube video directed to MMA fans who probably don't really care about pro wrestling history. But the thing that the gentleman drew my attention to was there's about a 4 or 5 minute kind of history of catch wrestling, professional wrestling, at about the 9-minute mark. And he asked me about the accuracy of a lot of it. I'm not going to take a whole lot out of it because for an overview of wrestling for MMA fans, it's fine. And a lot of the things that are in there are true, but just not in that order or that the way that. But there was a couple things I really wanted to point out in there that. So he attributes the creation of Catch as Catch Can to a gentleman in Wales in 1877, but catch wrestling in some form, and let's say what it was back then. It was Catch as Catch Can, and that's what it was called for a long time. That will be my third point I get to. But Catch as Catch Can as a style existed before 1877 in Wales, in England, and it definitely existed before 1877 in the United States, because it was the style that carnival wrestlers used, and professional wrestling in this country came from a combination of wrestlers doing Greco-Roman and challenging European wrestlers, and then the carnival wrestlers. And many of the best wrestlers produced in this country, Evan Strangler Lewis, Martin Farmer Burns, they all learned their professional wrestling style, Catch as Catch Can, from the carnival workers. So that isn't quite accurate. There was catch wrestling before that. It might not have been called Catch as Catch Can, but I know in the 1880s, at least in the early 1880s, and maybe even in the 1870s, they're calling it Catch as Catch Can in the United States, and there's only been a handful of English wrestlers that came over in the early 1880s at that point. And it would be called Catch as Catch Can in this country. They probably quit distinctively referring to it separate from professional wrestling, because after 1890, the Catch as Catch Can became the dominant style of professional wrestling in the United States. And after the 20s, it was the only style. I don't remember any Greco-Roman matches or Cornish wrestling, Cumberland. That all went out in the 19th century. Really, the only two styles that was wrestled professionally in the United States after the 1900s was Greco-Roman and Catch as Catch Can. And in England, in 1981, I was watching an episode of Are You Being Served, a British comedy from that time period. And they had Jackie Pallow, who was a famous British wrestler, on there. And he was supposed to be having a boxing match with Captain Peacock. But, of course, Captain Peacock can't box that day. So they were going to have a wrestling match. And Mr. Humphries had bragged about how he was the Catch-as-Catch-Can champion. So they referred to the wrestling style there multiple times as Catch-as-Catch-Can. The second thing I wanted to cover was the freestyle wrestling we know in the United States for the Olympics and high school and colleges, deriving from Catch-as-Catch-Can. And I do believe that its roots are from Catch-as-Catch-Can. It didn't evolve, at least in the United States, the way the video says, because Joe Stecker wrestled in high school in the 19-teens. Nat Pendleton was already both an Olympic and a college champion in the very early 1920s. And if you look at freestyle wrestling looks like Catch-as-Catch-Can wrestling without the submission holds. And some old-timers used to say that was the difference between amateurs and the pros. The pros knew submissions. The amateurs didn't. It's very hard to know the exact origins of everything. But because all the other popular styles were upper body throwing styles, with the exception of Catch-as-Catch-Can, which allowed single leg, double leg takedowns, you could use holds below the waist. All of the other styles that I'm aware of are all upper body throwing styles. So the Catch-as-Catch-Can wrestling, I think, was definitely the basis for freestyle wrestling. But freestyle wrestling, I don't know that that's exactly Catch-as-Catch-Can without the submission holds. Or were both of those styles developed around the same time, and you just didn't teach submission holds to people unless they were going to be involved in carnival wrestling or somebody had a carnival wrestling background. But I do believe that freestyle wrestling's roots are catch-related in some way. And then the last thing I want to touch on is just what I said, because I do use this term now, particularly in the writing. Writing Catch-as-Catch-Can a lot. It can be a bit much sometimes. And it also kind of messes with the formatting of your book sometimes, with all the hyphens and all that. And most people that are familiar with Catch-as-Catch-Can know it as catch wrestling because that's a modern term. Like I said, in 1891, they were still calling it Catch-as-Catch-Can in Britain. The first time I heard people talking about catch wrestling and meaning Catch-as-Catch-Can style wrestling was in the late 80s or early 90s, and they were all people that were being trained in legitimate Catch-as-Catch-Can submissions and that by Carl Gotch or Billy Robinson. Most of their students or people they've worked with call it catch wrestling. And everybody knows the term refers to the same thing. Catch-as-Catch-Can is catch wrestling. But catch wrestling is a more modern term. I've never seen it written up in the newspapers as catch wrestling at any time that I've studied, and I've gone as to the mid-30s in depth, and I've looked a little bit in the 40s just out of interest. But from 1870 to 1936 or 7, you never hear the term catch wrestling. If they do write out catch, it's Catch-as-Catch-Can. But it's a much easier term to write. But those are the people that I heard using that term. So when you hear catch wrestling, people are talking about Catch-as-Catch-Can. Other than that, I thought it was pretty accurate, and it's accurate enough to give you enough of a background to appreciate it as it applies to mixed martial arts. If you really want to get in the weeds and learn more history, I'll say I've written several books on the time frame. And Scott Teal, Tim Hornbaker, and several others have written lots of books about that time period too. So if you want to get in the weeds a little bit, you can pick up some of their books as well. And it'll get a little bit more in depth. But like I said, I didn't want to take too much out of it because as an overall lead in to an MMA topic, it's fine to give people enough of a background to have an understanding to appreciate it from an MMA, mixed martial arts standpoint. MMA was easy for me to say there. And with that, I'm going to end this little addendum, and we will just move on to the regular show. So enjoy episode 13. I hope that you'll come back in 2 weeks and check out what we're going to do about Cora Livingston. Take care. It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 13. Welcome to It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. This is the podcast that is dedicated to professional wrestling history from 1870 to 1920. And as we sit here today on Election Day in the United States, November 8th, 2022, we almost didn't get lucky episode 13 off the ground because after voting this morning on my way to my sister's to help her take care of something, either I hit something in the road or there was already a split in the tire, but my tire blew out. And I didn't know that my son was going to still be able to be here to do this because I'm going to go now get a tire tomorrow. But we're fortunate. We're going to be able to do the podcast. And since that happened this morning, I thought I was going to actually do the podcast as a solo episode. But Caleb's here.
Hello.
So we're going to do the regular podcast. However, I've changed the topics around a little bit, and I've decided on what the topics are going to be for the remainder of the year, since I thought today was going to be a solo episode. So today, for the main topic, we're going to talk, since we're getting ready to do the hard launch for shooting or working the history of the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. I'm going to talk about a title defense in that book that Tom Jenkins made. And then the next episode, which is going to be published on Monday, November 24th, will be on Cora Livingston, the first world women's professional wrestling champion. And December 5th, I'm going to discuss what we talked about potentially discussing with this episode. I could do it, but I've just released those posts. I don't want to do the posts and then the podcast back-to-back 3 weeks in a row. But I'm going to discuss the last two shoot matches that Ed Strangler Lewis had in 1934 and 1936. And one of them, Ed Strangler Lewis said, was the greatest legitimate contest he ever wrestled. I'll let you know whether I agree with that or not. And then the final podcast for the year is going to be on Monday, December 19th. And in that episode, I'm going to be talking about one of the matches that John, the Nebraska Tiger Man Pesic, wrestled. We've done a whole episode on him before, but there's a controversial match that actually didn't occur in 1930 that's got me thinking about actually being my next project is John the Nebraska Tiger Man Pesic. So we're going to do another episode on him, just focused on one aspect of his career. So that'll be the schedule for the remainder of the year. And one of the things I was going to tell you was I was thinking about when your Uncle Danny comes up for the holidays, maybe getting him on the podcast. Okay. And he can tell the story of when he thought I was going to get him killed when he was 14 and I was 17, and we were at the Kiel Auditorium downtown.
Yeah, I'll be outnumbered by 2 fans. Look extra dumb.
Well, Uncle Danny and I, the episode I had you watch, the not Raw.
Primetime?
The Primetime Wrestling episode I had you watch was actually my Aunt Willa, Uncle Danny's mom's favorite episode.
Yeah.
She was not a wrestling fan, so Aunt Willa didn't like wrestling, but she would let us watch it in the living room. If Uncle Lloyd was home, we didn't get to watch it in the living room, but
Yeah.
if Uncle Lloyd wasn't home, Aunt Willa would let us watch it, and she did not watch the wrestling, but she would watch the interactions between Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan and laugh. And that episode I had you watch was it was her favorite episode.
Yeah.
And we lost my Aunt Willa this year in September. She was 85 years old. And my cousin Danny and I were talking about some of the matches we had gone to and everything. And I thought that would be a good topic for the podcast.
Yeah, no.
So one of the things I wanted to do before Jim... So on the next episode, we can review the AEW investigation and all that. Because right now I really don't have the
wherewithal
strength
to go
or
for
wherewithal to go through all of that.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to look at it from a wrestling fan's point of view. I'm just going to purely look at it as someone who has had 100 employees reporting to him at one time. From a management, a director, an administrator's perspective, where I see all the problems with this. Now, I think those problems are going to lead to problems for that actual business.
Yeah.
Beyond whether the fans are really pissed off about it or not.
Yeah.
So, my question to you is, did you want to review the Primetime Wrestling episode on this show, or do you want to wait till the next show? Because there was a pay-per-view this week that I did watch. I'm sure you didn't.
Well, if I had to pay for it, you better believe I didn't.
No, you didn't. And these are all premium live events.
Oh, okay.
So it's free on Peacock.
Okay. I'm about to tell you, I'm like that. I'm poor. Yeah.
So, before we get into the topic for this week's show, one of the things I noticed the last couple weeks is I've left you without a whole lot to say on several of the episodes.
I mean, I'm still learning, so...
Right. I know you're learning about the wrestling, but you're my youngest son.
Right.
You're the youngest of the three. And the reason I picked you to be the co-host is, one, you're not afraid to speak in public.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you used to do stand-up and stuff like that.
Yes, I did. Poorly.
And out of my kids, you tend to be the one that's comes up with the best one-liners. Your mom and Uncle Danny got a great kick out of, hey, Dad, every time Mom wants to get rid of you, is she going to send you down to Uncle Danny's?
I mean, is it wrong, though?
Well, it was my idea to go down there, but
yeah,
he's got to get that house ready.
Yeah.
But he got a kick out of that one, too. But, so, you're my youngest son.
Yeah.
But you are also a father.
Yes, I am.
So, how many kids do you have?
I have two great, amazing boys.
Yeah. And one just had a birthday, and one's getting ready to have a birthday next week.
Yes, sir.
And you're married.
Yeah.
And you are a manager.
Yes, I am.
Where you're working, even though you're young. I won't give your exact age, but let's just say he's under 25.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you don't know a whole lot of wrestling because when we established the first podcast you were on, you were not a wrestling fan growing up. I wasn't watching it at that time. I pretty much switched to MMA. I did not watch professional wrestling from about 2009, for sure 2010 when we got rid of cable, but I had even quit watching it a year or so before that. So around 2008, 2009. And I didn't watch again until 2016. And that was NXT and Ring of Honor. I wasn't even watching the main WWE shows, let's face it. Until Triple H took over a few months ago, those things were pretty much unwatchable.
We heard Jim Cornette. Yes,
Yeah.
Yes, they were.
Yeah. The pay-per-views were not bad because there was less of the skits.
Mm-hmm.
It's the idiotic, childish skits that I found so difficult to deal with on those shows. And it was just a boring, juvenile offering. But you didn't watch any of that stuff.
No.
But growing up as a kid, you were in martial arts. You started TKD at 5. You started judo at 6.
Yeah.
And you always preferred judo. So, was there any particular reason you were drawn to grappling, or?
It just worked better. I liked how smooth it was, especially fighting, and I'm a big guy, so I had a lot of leverage there. So that always worked out. I do like striking, but I don't know. There's something good about being able to throw someone down and change position while fighting.
Right.
It's good knowing you can do that.
The one thing I think that grappling, and that's the reason I wanted you guys to do judo, is if you're a good judo player, if you're a good wrestler, you control where that fight takes part.
Yeah.
You know, I think that if you get into judo, now it wasn't always this way. I've heard people say that in the 20s, judo was very developed on the ground.
Yeah.
But because of the rule set, it is developed where it's mostly stand-up now. With the throws and that. So, but you guys started doing jiu-jitsu as soon as I did too. So
yeah,
you were doing ground grappling as well to supplement your throws and everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was always drawn to the grappling, and it really helped me because you're about 6 foot and about 270. I was 5'9", 5'10", but I was 240, and so I was hard to throw, and I could get up underneath people real easy. So that was a great sport for me.
Yeah.
But that's one of the other reasons I picked you for this is with your grappling background. Even though these guys are working together, it is, boy, it's really strayed a lot from grappling. But you can at least kind of watch it. The older stuff, I think, you make more sense of than the stuff you're going to see.
I was watching Mr. Perfect fight Rick Martel, and they did a complete flying throw, and I'm like, oh, well, that's not sanctioned. That was fake.
Yeah. There's no way some of those things are gonna fly. So yeah, they're cooperating with each other and working with each other. So maybe we will review that at the end, because did you see the main event, which was the Ultimate Warrior versus Haku?
I didn't. I thought the Mr. Perfect Rick Martel was the highlight because they were former heavyweight.
I wonder if you watched the week before, because that was a 2-week thing.
Okay.
They were on the Western set 2 weeks in a row.
Okay.
The second one is the better one, but those episodes are both great.
Okay.
And these episodes are in 1989. We'll have to look up the dates, and I'll put those dates in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com/episode 13. I'm thinking they were in February of 89.
They were. The 6th is the one that I watched.
Okay, so February 6th, and it's probably February 13th, because I'm thinking you watched the first one.
Season 5, episode 6. I had to look it up.
And that episode, so you heard what he just said there. Go ahead and repeat it.
Season 5, episode 6 of Primetime Wrestling.
Yeah. So you must have watched the first one, because the main event for the second one, and that does sound right, Mr. Perfect versus Rick Martel, that would have been a main event for that show, because a lot of the wrestling was god-awful.
Yeah.
The second show, the main event, was Ultimate Warrior versus King Tonga.
Okay.
So we'll talk about that first episode at the end of this. So what I wanted to get into, because this is one of the more fascinating matches I found in the book, but not because of the actual wrestling. Mm-hmm. Even though this was a legitimate contest.
Yeah.
And as unlike some other legitimate contests, this one wasn't boring.
Okay.
But because, one, Jenkins was pretty much more dominant than McLeod. He beat McLeod, and he beat McLeod for several matches. So when they wrestled on Christmas night, there was no reason for people to think that this match was going to be any different than the other matches. Yeah. Jenkins was going to win, because Jenkins had pretty much showed he was the better wrestler than McLeod. And remember what I said, Jenkins and George Hackenschmidt are the only two wrestlers who I believe did not take part in work matches. I haven't found anybody else yet that I don't think at least worked some of the matches.
Okay.
So Jenkins defended his title on Christmas night in Worcester, Massachusetts, and probably thought they were going to draw a decent crowd, but unfortunately they only drew a little over 1,000 fans, about 1,100. And this is 1902, Christmas night 1902. That would have been a great crowd 10 years before that. Mm-hmm. But at this point in time, they're starting to draw 3,000 to 5,000 fans to most title matches. So this crowd is a big disappointment, number one.
Yeah.
And they're wrestling in the Mechanics Hall in Worcester, Massachusetts. Now, what the fans didn't know is when Jenkins entered the ring, he entered the ring at a major disadvantage because he had injured his leg in training, and blood poisoning had actually set in. And Jenkins didn't want to cancel the bout because he had a $500 forfeit up. So if he canceled the match, McLeod would get the $500, and then they would have to reschedule the rematch again.
Yeah.
So instead of surrendering the $500, he went ahead because even though he was weakened, he thought, I could still beat McLeod. I beat him easily in the past. And this was a very foolish decision on Jenkins' part because blood poisoning back in that day and age is fatal.
Yeah.
Okay. It won't kill anybody today. You'll get a treatment of antibiotics and you'll be fine. But back in that day, so, I've researched a lot on the history of the St. Louis Police Department, and I've written books on it. A lot of the officers who died in the line of duty from, say, the 1880s to as late as probably the late teens, maybe early 30s, they would suffer what they thought, and the doctors thought at the time, were minor wounds.
Okay.
They'd be sent home to recover. And one of the most egregious cases I'm actually going to talk about before we get into this particular match, because Jenkins was very foolish to do this. Because what happens when you start working out and you're wrestling with people?
Your muscles start going and the blood starts circulating.
Yes, the blood starts circulating through the body. So if you get blood poisoning, you're moving that blood poisoning throughout your system and kill you much quicker.
Yeah.
It's a miracle that the blood poisoning didn't kill him because this was a fatal disease. There was no treatment for it.
Yeah.
So he must have had a mild case. And the bandage he wore made it even worse. But let's go back to the blood poisoning. So in 1893, D.A. Boone, who was a mounted police officer in St. Louis City, chasing after a guy who he believes has stolen a horse. The guy fires back over his shoulder and nicks his wrist, literally nicks his wrist with a bullet. He goes for treatment. All they do is wrap it. He doesn't even go home to convalesce. He basically goes back on duty for a few weeks. Starts feeling bad after a couple weeks. Doctor takes a look. Blood poisoning is set in. So they send him home. Don't move around. Don't do anything. That's your only hope of recovery because there's no treatment for it at this time.
Yeah.
Within a week, he dies from a nick on the wrist.
Yeah.
Today, they pour a little antibiotic on it, wrap it up, and send you on your way. And that's pretty much what they did with him in 1893. But blood poisoning set in. That's how deadly a killer that was in that day and age. So this was very foolish. $500 could have cost him his life.
Yeah.
But the one thing I've learned in researching professional wrestling, money is usually at the heart of everything. Double crosses, the gambling schemes, all this stuff. It's about making money. Guys get into the all combat sports to make money while they can. So Jenkins goes ahead with this match. And Jenkins puts a brace on his leg, but the braces in those days weren't like we have today where you just wrap a ace bandage around it, you get those little soft clips and everything. This is a bandage that has brass buttons on it.
Oh.
So the brass buttons go up say it had 10 brass buttons on it. Well, he starts wrestling, and a couple of the brass buttons start digging in to the wound. Blood starts rolling into the bandage. They can see that the brass buttons are pushing inward, sticking it into the wound and that, making it much worse. Despite all of this, Jenkins won the first fall in 53 minutes with a three-quarter Nelson. And he had to be helped to the back during the intermission because the blood poisoning is starting to take effect on him. He comes out and the buckles are digging into his things. He just rips the brace off. because the buttons are doing worse damage to him than McLeod is.
Yeah.
But McLeod senses the advantage, and he actually takes Jenkins down with a half Nelson and crotch hold and pins him.
Yeah.
So let me back up. The brass buttons were digging into his leg for the first fall and the second fall.
Yeah.
Between the second and the third fall, he rips that brace off. He's just going to go out there because it's worsening what he's dealing with. So that he tore off the brace between the second and the third fall. They wrestle for 20 minutes and nobody's really gaining an advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And Jenkins wants to continue, but he's obviously in no condition to continue. And the referee was a respected referee by the name of George Toohey.
Yeah.
And Toohey steps in and says, "I don't think you can continue. I think I'm going to have to stop the match on a forfeit."
Yeah.
And Jenkins doesn't want to because Jenkins doesn't want to lose his title. He wants to continue with the match.
Mm-hmm.
But Toohey lets him go maybe 5 more minutes, and then he stops the match, and he awards the match and the championship back to McLeod.
Yeah.
So Jenkins was a 3-time champion.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he was a 3-time champion because we've already talked about him and Gotch split their competitive series 3-3.
Yeah.
Later on, after he was a semi-retired instructor at West Point, Gotch beat him 2 more matches.
Yeah.
But I don't consider that the competitive series. And he lost the title to Gotch and he won the title back from Gotch. But his first 2 title reigns were defeats over McLeod.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously McLeod's not going to hold this title any longer than it takes Jenkins to recover.
Yeah.
And fortunately for Jenkins, he did recover. Toohey probably saved his life by stopping the match when he did.
Mm-hmm.
And Jenkins had to go home and just basically lay there for a month. But he did recover. And then he got his rematch with Dan McLeod in April of 1903. I found that match fascinating because of the blood poisoning aspect. When I had read he got blood poisoning, I was like, well, I know he didn't die because I knew he had those matches with Gotch and that later on. But that was unusual.
Yeah.
Blood poisoning a lot of times with a death sentence from very minor wounds, a bullet grazed to the wrist and stuff. And I don't want to speak out of school, but I think it was the unique thing with the bullets having gunpowder and stuff on them.
Yeah.
When they hit people, that blood poisoning tended to kill people more because most of the people I know most of the officers who were stabbed or had a broken bone or something recovered. Even when they got blood poisoning, it was minor. But people that got shot in that era, if they got blood poisoning, it was usually fatal.
Yeah.
So that may be one of the things that led to why he didn't get a fatal dose of it, because he didn't have residue or something from that injury that was getting in to the blood as well. But I find it more fascinating from the blood poisoning aspect than
yeah, no, I mean, the fact that he went 2 rounds before...
Yeah, he couldn't go anymore.
Yeah.
Is amazing, with that. And when we talk about one of Ed Lewis's final matches, it's going to be a similar thing. He persevered through something that most people should never be able to persevere through. But Jenkins was a super tough guy, so... So you watched the first episode. So you saw where the show started. They threw dynamite over a wall, and then Bobby comes in through the thing, coughing and waving and stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so you saw the first one. So that one was good too. That was a rare location shoot on Primetime Wrestling. Mm-hmm. Most of the time they were in a studio. Yeah. If you watch any other episode, almost all the time they were in a studio. The only other one I can remember where they did something, I don't know that you would call that a set. It was a set that they did that Western thing on, because they were supposed to be on the set of a Western film.
Yeah.
They did a couple where they were out on boats. They did one where Bobby was supposed to be taking Gorilla to Andre the Giant's training camp right before Andre wrestled Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 3.
Yeah.
And that was kind of an on-location shoot. They went out in the woods somewhere. But for the most part, they shot in the studio. So this was a little bit unusual. They would do these special shoots every great once in a while. I think they went to Caesar's Palace a couple times. But for the most part, they shot everything in that Primetime Wrestling studio in Stamford, Connecticut. But this one was a supposed location shooting on a Western set. So, did any of the other matches stick out to you other than Mr. Perfect and Rick Martel? Those guys are really good.
Yeah, not really.
So, we didn't have the capability to stream back in that day.
Yeah.
If we had, we would probably only have watched the segments with Bobby and Gorilla, and we would have skipped most of the matches because the matches were pretty abysmal. So Pedro Morales was the WWE World Champion, and he was an incredible wrestler in the 70s. But by the 80s, he was in his mid-40s, and it seemed like he was on Primetime Wrestling every single week, wrestling some other mid-carder at that point, or low main event type guy. And he would put those guys over, and then if he was wrestling a mid-card guy, a lot of times Pedro would go over. But Danny and I were talking about that. Some of the matches you saw there. Now, you did occasionally, when the British Bulldogs and the Hart Foundation first came into the WWE, they weren't tag teams yet.
Yeah.
And there was a show from Toronto where Brett wrestled, he might have wrestled Dynamite, which was a big rivalry in the Calgary area.
Mm-hmm.
And they always had great matches. And then Davey Boy wrestled somebody else, and Jim Neidhart wrestled somebody else. But they had come in as singles, and then they put those guys together as tag teams.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the wrestling was pretty abysmal. You know, you'd have C.V. Affi versus Mike Sharp. That's not going to sell out anything. And for this show, the interactions between Gorilla and everything clearly outstripped everything else.
Yeah.
That was what would draw people in to watch. So, was there anything memorable about that show that stuck out to you?
The ending of the between Perfect and Martel, where they actually drew. They came to a draw, and I got to hear an entire stadium boo out everybody. So
those in that era, draws were much more common.
Yeah.
You had time limits. So in St. Louis, somebody normally went over, or somebody normally, or it was a draw. And a lot of TV matches were draws. So remember early on, I had you watch Kerry Von Erich versus Ciampa. That was a 10-minute draw. That was common. You almost never see draws today because, for one, WWE did away with time limits ages ago. So if you get a draw, they don't call it a draw because there's no time limit. It's a double DQ. So both people were disqualified. But it really limits what you're doing because then you either got to have this stupid brawl where these guys are getting DQ'd, or, but in the old days, they could just go 20 minutes and nobody would win. And you could juice up the matches to get people to come in to watch a pay-per-view now or a premium live event. In the old days, you were trying to get them to go to the live events at the local arenas. So you'd have them go to a 10 or 15-minute draw, but at the end of that 15-minute draw, it would look like that guy was going to beat the champion if he just had 5 more minutes. Well, come out this Friday and watch him wrestle because it's an hour time limit.
Yeah.
You know, that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
So... and obviously not much stuck out to you on that show, you know.
I mean, the Western bits were funny.
Yeah, the comedy with Gorilla and them were always hilarious, but a lot of the wrestling just didn't stand out. And in that era, the wrestling in the NWA Jim Crockett Promotions was so much better than what was going on in WWE.
Yeah.
Even though they had really good, talented guys, they hadn't gone to Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart yet. So they had older guys, bigger guys, and they always went. There was one exception. When Hogan had his matches with Paul Orndorff, those were really good matches. mostly because of Mr. Wonderful, because Hogan didn't have those kind of matches with most other people. He was always fighting these big giant guys.
Yeah.
But Orndorff could go, and he was believable against a 6 foot. He always said he was 6'8", but about a 6'5", 200 something pound, 280, 290 baby face.
Yeah.
Paul Orndorff, because of his physique and everything, he was believable in that role against Hogan. So those were some good matches. The Macho Man versus Ricky Steamboat match from WrestleMania 3 is one of the greatest matches of all time.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the WWE product in the 80s and early 90s until they went to Brett and Shawn, it's really not that good. There was something else I was going to... Oh. So I watched that Premium Live event from Saudi Arabia. I didn't watch all the matches. And that's actually the first Premium Live event since Triple H took over that I didn't watch everything. Because number one, I had some things to do, you know.
Yeah.
I was down the country trying to get some things done, so I didn't have time to just sit there and watch the whole thing straightforward. I had to run over to Grandma Teresa's and all that. But even then, I was like, okay, the only matches on this thing I'm really looking forward to is Lashley versus Lesnar, Drew McIntyre versus Karrion Kross. So that was my favorite match on the last Premium Live event. This one in the cage just didn't, it wasn't as good. And I don't know if it was the cage. I'm not quite sure what it was, because the last match when they had the strap match, and generally I don't like strap matches, and modern strap matches are kind of crappy. But that was a better match. And then Reigns versus Logan Paul was pretty amazing. Reigns is good at anything. This Logan Paul, I had no idea who he was before he started showing up challenging people to box and everything.
Yeah.
But he has to have some kind of really good athletic background, because this guy is a hell of an athlete. And he blew his MCL out halfway through the match and still wrestled the whole match. He picked Roman Reigns up on his shoulder and did a power slam with that knee messed up. So kudos to Logan Paul. You're a hell of an athlete, if nothing else. And he and Roman Reigns, you're in there with the best right now. I know Roman says he's the GOAT. I don't quite go that far. But Roman is without question the best in the ring now. And then even though I really like the Usos normally, and I would normally always watch their matches, I've seen them with the Battling Brutes enough. I didn't need to watch another Battling Brutes match. And had no interest in the girls' tag team match. I watched a little bit of Bianca Belair and Bayley. They usually put on fantastic matches.
Yeah.
When they go to Saudi Arabia, though, all the women have to cover up.
Yeah.
So they're not in their normal gear. And I don't want to ogle them, but they just look odd not wearing their normal gear in these matches.
They didn't look like athletes.
They did look like athletes, but it's odd. You know, you see them in this gear, and it's not like, oh, we're putting on gear because it's WrestleMania or something.
Yeah.
It's like because of the rules of the country, which you have to respect when you're there.
Yeah.
We've got to cover up. So it's the first one I didn't watch all the way through, but I'm going to say the pay-per-views under Vince were normally better than the Raw and SmackDown under Vince, which were unwatchable.
Yeah.
Vince, I don't know what happened to him in the last fight. Well, if we believe the investigation's going on, he was distracted. It was not nearly as good, and even the pay-per-views would have some really stupid juvenile crap on it.
Yeah.
Under Triple H, the product as a whole has been much better. I used to be able to watch an entire weeks of WWE under Vince in just under a half an hour, because what's Roman Reigns doing? Is there any other match in all this stuff they put on worth watching this week? The answer a lot of times was no, and you'd be done. the shows are much better. They're watchable now.
Yeah.
The pay-per-views have been much, much better. Premium live events. So overall, I would give Triple H's reign as the head of creative a thumbs up. I think Triple H and Stephanie can really turn the WWE back around.
Yeah.
And I really would like to see AEW succeed because competition makes things better.
Yeah.
After this investigation, I don't think it's going to happen, and we'll talk about that next week. But really, if you're a wrestling fan, you at least have something plausible to watch now.
Yeah.
Whereas before, it was just a lot of really bad wrestling, and I just really wasn't that interested.
Yeah.
So, my favorite era is probably always going to be the era I grew up in, but I'm not going to really write or research about that because I'm more interested in the history and talking about, when it was a mixture of working and shooting.
Yeah.
So, well, where are we at time-wise, bud?
35 minutes.
Well, I think we've talked all your ears off for this episode. Remember, the next episode, episode 14, will be released on Monday, November 24th, and we're going to talk about Cora Livingston, who was the first recognized women's wrestling champion. As much as I've researched this era, I've recently discovered her.
Oh, yeah?
I always thought Mildred Burke was the first, and it's actually Cora Livingston. And she was active from about 1904, 5, 6, somewhere in there, till the late teens, early 20s. And the reason that is because I think it was 1908, but I'll have the exact date, or I'll have at least the exact year for the next podcast. Cora Livingston married Paul Bowser, the longtime promoter of Boston. But when she married him, they were just both wrestlers.
Yeah.
And he got his beginnings in promotion by wrestling himself and promoting his wife. So he was promoting her matches. And then when he became the promoter in Boston, the local promoter for Boston, she retired from the ring and helped him promote. And they promoted that Boston from the late teens, early 20s into the 1950s when they both passed away. Yeah. So she's a trailblazer in more ways than one. I don't think there were anybody, and while Paul would have been there, I don't think there was any female promoters until Mildred Burke and her husband Billy Wolf started promoting women's wrestling.
Yeah.
And Cora Livingston was helping Paul Bowser promote men's wrestling in Boston. So she's a trailblazer in more ways than one, and I need to do a lot more research on her because a lot more needs to be written, and she needs to be known. That's I'm sure that the obstacles she overcame just to get wrestling were probably tremendous back in 1908. I mean, realize you're in an era where most of the time women were not allowed to be spectators.
Yeah.
In New York in 1915, it was a big deal that they let women in the Manhattan Opera House to watch the 1915 International Wrestling Tournament. And Sam Rockman, who was the promoter, really pushed that because women were allowed to go to the wrestling matches in Europe. But in the United States, they were still very backwards with their laws a lot of times. I mean, you'd go out west, women weren't allowed in saloons. Women weren't allowed here. And for a long time, women weren't allowed at wrestling matches or place where men would be semi-clothed and stuff like that. I mean, we all know what happens when you try to legislate morality. So it was really silly. But that was the norm back then, so it's really something to overcome that in your career. So that's it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. You can find the show notes for this and every episode at KenzermanJr.com, and you can look either under the podcast category, or you can just put KenzermanJr.com/episode, whatever episode you want. You just put the number behind episode, and it'll pop up with the show notes. And until next time, enjoy, be safe, and we'll see you.
Catch you later, guys.